So one of the things that I promised you is we would look at how to avoid having a bunch of extra files kind of cluttering up your repo. And sometimes it makes perfect sense to keep these files there. They might be data files that the code references a lot, but you don't actually want to track, or things like that. Um, and so Git provides a mechanism to let it know that you are not, in fact, going to track these files. So I've created a new folder in my Git folder, lesson 1b, and there's a number of files. So it's got the same US states and time periods files, but there's some extra files, some with the .dat extension, another text file, and then there's a bunch in the ignore me folder. Some have the .dat extension, some are pretending to be MATLAB scripts, some are pretending to be Python scripts, some are pretending to be text files. And all of the new files are just empty files. I just did a bunch of touch, pest1.txt, that sort of thing. So go ahead and do this. I've also gone ahead and done a commit so that the US dates, months, and days of week are being tracked. One thing you could do is if you just say copy your lesson 1A folder, then you won't need to make a commit because the Git repository will follow you over, and then just add all these extra files. And the way, so the way that you tell Git to ignore certain files or certain file types is by creating in the top folder of the repo a .gitignore file. This is just a text file, and there's, this is basically just going to be a list of rules by which Git learns to ignore certain files. And there's three basic types you can do: specific files, file types, so usually by extension, or by folder. So I'm actually going to stop for a second and look at the status. So you'll notice that there's a lot of untracked files. There's these data files, this extra file, and this whole folder. If we decide that we really don't want these, we need to use the .gitignore file. Let's start with a simple one. We just want to ignore specifically the extra .txt file. So all you do is add that file name to the gitignore file and save it. And now if we run git status, you'll notice that extra.txt no longer shows up, but the gitignore file itself does. So if we didn't want the gitignore file to show up, just add the file itself to the ignore file. It will not hurt anything. And now if we do git status, you'll notice that gitignore is also gone. And if you look online for Git tutorials, you may see different arguments for whether or not you should actually ignore the gitignore folder or file. There are arguments in either way. I tend to ignore it in all of my repositories because I don't intend to synchronize it. But I think that the case where you would find it most useful to track that is if you are sharing this repository with other collaborators. Then you might want to go ahead and make sure everyone at least starts with the same gitignore file to make sure that, say, data files are not synced to the repository. But then, of course, if each person has different files that they specifically want to ignore, they have to make sure not to push those changes. And so, it's really something that you'll have to decide on a case-by-case basis. But generally, I don't track it. Okay, so if we move on, we've still got a bunch of .dat files. And there's actually, remember, more in the ignore me folder. And to make a point, I'm actually going to add a file in the ignore me folder, just example.txt, and add that one. Git add, there we go. Trying to type a little too fast here. And I'm just going to say, making a point about get status. I'm going to be a little lazy and just go ahead and save this. Now if I run get status, because we're tracking a file in this ignore me folder, now get status shows all of the other files in that folder. And let's say that we know for a fact we're never going to track a data file because they're not plain text files. Git can't track the differences, and we don't want to synchronize them. So, just as globbing works fine for git add, it works fine here too. And star.dat will now hide not only the two .dat folders in the root, or not root, but top level directory, it also hides the .dat files in the ignore me folder. And so in one stroke, we've gotten rid of 4 files that we know we're never going to track. Now let's say that we knew we really weren't going to track anything in this folder, except for that one file. What we could do is we could add to the end of our file here a line like this, the folder name / and a star. And now, if we ran get status, everything in the ignore me folder is ignored, even though they have different extensions. And so between these 3 basic rules, and there are more advanced rules, for instance, the pattern 2 stars and a / means match this pattern in any subdirectory. So for instance, this would match in any subdirectory only, so not in the top level directory, any file ending in .annoyance. And so this is a way that you can just help clean up your Git repository a little bit and make sure that you don't get these constant messages. You are under no obligation to create a git ignore file if you don't want one, but it's a nice tool to have. Now, if you do realize eventually that you made a mistake and you actually want to track something, or you at least want to see something, it's really easy to fix. For instance, say we wanted to actually see extra.txt. Just delete that line from the git ignore file, and it will show up just fine. There's one more thing to show you, and that is that you can, in fact, add files that are ignored. So I'm going to try to add data1. You'll notice it tells you the following paths are ignored by one of your git ignore files, data1.dat. But it tells us if we really want to add them, we just need to use the -f flag. So if I did git add -f data1, and now git status, it's been added, but none of the other .dat files show up. So this is just something to keep in mind. If, say, there's 1 or 2 really important data files that you do want to track, just to make sure that they still exist, you can. And it doesn't mess up the ignore rule for the other .dat files. It just allows you to override that rule in one special case. So that concludes lesson 1. We've covered all the basics from configuring global options with something like that, to initializing a repository, and then we've covered some of the most basic commands, including git status, which shows you the overall status of the repository, diff, which, if there were any changes, would show you in this form the changes between the last commit and the working directory, or the changes between any 2 arbitrary commits. We've looked at git ls files, which tells us which files are being tracked. In this case, we have 5. And we've looked at git log, which gives us a list and a history of all our commits. So right now you have all the tools you need to use Git in a linear fashion, where you're just tracking changes to your code over time. And it's useful enough in this sense. But it has an even more potent capability, which is the ability to create multiple branches or multiple versions of the code, which allow you to, say, develop the code in one branch while keeping a stable version in another branch, and then it gives you the tools to merge code between those branches very efficiently. And we'll look at that next time.